Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the PSNI Global Alliance webinar with our global vendor partner, Williams AV. I'm Tom Roberts, the Director of Vendor Programs for the Alliance. Language interpretation plays such a critical role in breaking down communication barriers, and being heard today and understood is so important. It's my pleasure to introduce Nancy Blanchard, Global Consultant Liaison at Williams AV, and Per Persson, Vice President of International Sales, for an overview of the critical role language interpretation plays in breaking down communication barriers in our diverse communities and businesses. Today's webinar will be recorded. A link will be provided to you as soon as it's made available. All attendees will be in the listen-only mode. We really encourage you to ask questions, so please use the question box to the right of the screen. We'll address them as soon as the Williams AV presentation is concluded. With that, now let me turn the program over to Nancy Blanchard. Welcome,
Thank you,
Nancy.
Tommy. Thank you. And greetings, everyone, and welcome to our final webinar with Williams AV and PSNI for 2022. And soon we'll be entering into 2023 with more educational webinars to deliver to you. So today, as Tommy mentioned, we're going to talk about language interpretation, the markets, the applications. And first, to start off with is, let's look at, where did Williams AV start off? It was founded in 1976 by Jerry Williams and was known as Williams Sound. And there's an interesting story here. Jerry was an engineer and he was actively involved in his church. And the pastor approached him and asked if he could come up with assistance to help the congregation be able to hear the sermon. So, as I said, being an engineer, he played around with AM transmitters and receivers to tune in. He produced a few, and then all of a sudden they were in demand, and it grew from there to where we are now with Williams AV. We're manufacturing in the US. We export to over 60 countries. Most of our Williams AV products are manufactured here in the US. And then where economically feasible, in trade-friendly countries, such as the receivers are in Vietnam, and then our Digi-Wave transceivers are South Korea. We have Tech Blue, which is important to our PSNI members, which provides design services, best for you technology, spec development, product and product install training. We do coverage modeling. And so you can reach out to them. We have a form on our website, which is www.williamsav.com. And by filling out a design request form, they'll get in touch with you. And then, as I mentioned, we are proud to be a preferred vendor partner with PSNI Global Alliance. And we encourage you, please get in touch with us with any of your projects, your designs. We'll put you in touch with your local representative. So with our mission, we started off as assistive listening. I was just at actually a court show in Vegas, and I got back last night. And so people would walk by and see assistive communication and ask, what is this? And so once I say, well, we started out with assistive listening, which, you know, is your assistive listening, your intercom, your tour guide, but then we broaden out. And so our portfolio now involves interpretation and translation, real-time open captioning and translation to break the language barriers, as well as video annotation. So 4K live video annotation that would be used in court systems for evidence, for trials, as well as teaching hospitals, teaching universities, athletic colleges, such as the NFL uses the video annotation. So we're providing assistive communication technology solutions, and that's to help people hear, see, and engage. Because you've got a broader range. You've got older people, people with neurodiversity, such as ADHD, dyslexia, autism, audio processing disorder, and also, you know, people in noisy environments. So disability is diverse and comes in many forms. So we're addressing inclusion with our assistive communication technology. And so as you see here under wireless audio, is that there are certain technologies that actually can address these three different markets. Digi-Wave, which is our digital RF, operating on a 2.4 gigahertz with frequency hopping, as well as the traditional FM. And then Wavecast, which is our Wi-Fi, works well with assistive listening as well as in language interpretation. And then as for other applications, infrared and induction loop. So if you wear a T-coil, then you just turn that on and then you're able to intelligibly hear what is going on in that defined area. Video and artificial intelligence, as I mentioned, with the Video Annotation Pro Plus, and then the captioning and translation. So you can just have open captioning, which it's real time. So if I'm speaking, you're going to see that on a display so that people can follow along. Or with Convey Video is I might have the input language as English, but then we're translating it into Spanish, German, or one of the other 105 languages. So what we're doing is we are addressing the whole market so that all can feel included. And then in terms of, let's give you a language and interpretation overview. Now, I don't know if you're aware of this, but I found it interesting when we were doing the research. There are 7,139 languages spoken in the world today. Now, do you know how many of those are people that don't speak English as their first language? That's approximately 7.5 billion people in the world. And then for those that don't even speak English, it's approximately 6.5 billion people. So looking at those facts, how many people speak English as their first language? 360 million people. So the world of languages, it's fascinating and it's interesting when you consider these facts. And more companies are increasingly doing business across borders, or they're holding business meetings where multiple languages are spoken. In this regard, language interpreters globally, they play a major role in breaking down language barriers by connecting those who speak different languages. Where is interpretation used? Thanks to globalization, as I mentioned, the world is more connected than it's ever been. With businesses embracing the international market space, there's a growing need for interpreters to help bridge the language barrier. So organizations such as the international UN, the EU, NATO, IMF, etc., they're using interpretation. And one thing in common that they all have is that they're using our Digi-Wave. Another interesting fact, just quick to tell you before we talk about the other markets where it's used, is that the UN has 6 official languages. There's English, Spanish, French, Russian, Chinese, and Arabic. But do you know internally, they only use French and English for spoken and for documents. Now, other organizations that are using interpretation would include the government, as well as events or courts. You have a defendant who maybe speaks Spanish, but the defense speaks English. So now you have to have an interpreter off to the side so that they can interpret and engage with one another. Schools, universities, hospitals, corporate settings, and house of worship all use interpretation in one way or another. So what about translation versus interpretation? We've heard about this often, and they're used interchangeably. Translation and interpretation are actually 2 vastly different activities. Translation deals with written language, unlike interpretation, which focuses on spoken language. So interpreters must translate in real time scenarios, whereas with translators, generally they'll have time to where they can find the best possible translation for specific words and phrases. So what we're going to do is I'm going to pass it over to Per, and he's going to talk about the different types of interpretation and give you examples. So there you go, Per.
Thanks a lot, Nancy, and I apologize that I'm a little bit hoarse today. Hopefully, I make it through okay. So the first scenario I'd like to discuss is consecutive interpretation. So how that works is you have a presenter speaking in English, and you have an interpreter who waits until the presenter is done speaking until they do their interpretation. So what does that mean for the audience? It means they will first hear the original language, for example, English, then the interpreter will speak in Spanish, for example. So it's not a very practical way to do interpretation. We see this being used mostly in informal settings, but for a big event, it's not a very good use of time. So what we deal with as a company is with solutions for simultaneous interpretation. So simultaneous interpretation means that the interpreter, instead of having to wait for the presenter to be done with a sentence or a paragraph, they will continuously speak while the presenter is speaking. So it's a very challenging thing to do. As you might hear from my accent, I speak several different languages. Swedish is my mother tongue, and I don't think I could possibly do simultaneous interpretation because you need to have in your mind what the speaker is saying while you're speaking in a different language at the same time. So one scenario for simultaneous interpretation is in portable settings. Now, the traditional way to do this is to really use a one-way solution for a portable interpretation setting. So in this example, we have an interpreter who has a separate receiver. So in order to hear what the presenter is saying, he receives the audio feed wirelessly on a receiver. But the thing that is a little bit clunky with this solution is he has to have a different transmitter to send on a separate channel to those people who needs interpretation into Spanish in this example. So Nancy mentioned our Digi-Wave product. We introduced the first version about 12 years ago in 2010. And one of the big inventions we had at that time was what we called the true interpretation mode. So now for the interpreter, instead of having two separate devices, in the one DLT transceiver, he's able to listen to the original language, English in this example, in his headset, and send out a separate language to the participants, so Spanish in this example. And here's another illustration of this, where some people listen to the original blue language. Hopefully it's not really blue language. And some people listen to the interpreted red language. And you see the blonde lady who's the interpreter. She will listen to the original blue language in her ears. She interprets into red, and that's then being transferred into the audience, which will have a choice of what language to listen to. The other setting for simultaneous interpretation is a more formal fixed conference setting. So this is where you will have typically interpreters, booths, soundproofed, and you will have typically a couple of interpreters taking turns interpreting. Since it is a very challenging task, most guidelines recommend that each interpreter interprets for maybe 15 or 20 minutes, then have a chance to rest their brain a little bit before they go live again. So they will do that using an interpreter's console, which is connected to some kind of wireless transmission technologies. From Williams, we offer 4 different versions that I will speak about soon. And the audience will listen to the different interpreter languages using receivers. Some important terminology. is floor language, for example. So floor language is the language the presenter is speaking. So you can think about who has the floor. That language is used as the floor language. The target language or languages is the languages that the interpretation is being done into. So for example, we could have a presenter speaking English. The target languages might be Spanish, Japanese, and French, for example. Another very important term in a language interpretation context is relay. So this is something that's used sometimes where there are several active languages. So you can think about a relay language as kind of a bridge language or an in-between step. So say we have a scenario, for example, where somebody speaks a weird language, let's say a more unusual language, let's say Swedish, for example. And Nancy is tasked with interpreting into French. The problem is Nancy does not speak Swedish. So there might be an interpreter interpreting from Swedish to English. Excellent. Nancy speaks English pretty well from my experience. So Nancy would then interpret from English into French, and that language, English, is called the relay language in this situation. So Williams-AV offers 4 different wireless technology for interpretation: infrared, FM, Digi-Wave, digital RF, and widecast audio via Wi-Fi. So all of these technologies has their advantages and certain disadvantages. So the reason why we offer all of them is it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. Depending on your setting, depending on your organization, depending on how many languages you have and different factors, you have different choices. So one of the main things to consider is the number of languages. How many wireless channels do you need? So infrared has up to 4 languages, whereas Wavecast can handle up to 64 different wireless channels. They all have different main benefits. Infrared is an easy way to keep your transmission secure. The signal stays within the room. FM is an easy install with very large coverage. Digi-Wave, as we talked about a little bit earlier, and I'll go into this a bit more, is very portable. It's also highly secure, so it's sometimes being used in places like courtrooms. It has 128 plus 87-bit encryption. And then finally, Wavecast is scalable. You can easily stack multiple servers to go to 8, 16, 24, etc. number of channels. And it has the benefit of bringing your own device. So at the illustration up on top, you can get an idea of how it works. The idea is instead of the audience borrowing a receiver, they download an app on their own mobile phone, and that way they can receive the audio stream, which in this case could be provided in different languages, say Spanish, French, Japanese, English, etc., etc. Based on the different benefits and challenges, we see that while most of these technologies could be used in various applications and verticals, we see that infrared is very common with courts and conferences, whereas FM really shines in the house of worship market. Digi-Wave does well in courts and corporate, and Wavecast Wi-Fi is very good for large events where you need many channels, you need a lot of people to be connected, and it's also found a good following in the house of worship market as well. So Nancy touched very briefly on this in the product overview. Williams-AV we have been working with interpretation using humans almost since the inception of our company, and often at trade shows, we would show Digi-Wave and some equipment, and we'll get the question, you know, oh, does this translate automatically? And we'd have to say, no, you need a guy for that, right? You need a highly trained professional to provide the interpretation. Now, since about a year and a half, we actually do have a solution with Convey Video that provides AI-powered translation. So if you think back to the difference between translation and interpretation, translation is written. So what this product provides is subtitles, if you will, or something close to subtitles as the person is speaking. In this example, we see, let's assume he's speaking in English since we're in America, and you'll see subtitles come up live in Arabic as the person is speaking. Now, this clearly provides a very interesting alternative, especially when live interpreters are not available or within the scope of budget. There is an hourly license cost for Convey Video, but it's just a fraction of the cost of hiring a professional interpreter. Now, another question we get all the time is how accurate is Convey? And, you know, we have some data, we could throw out some numbers, but I think the key thing to consider is Convey is most of the time not as accurate as a highly trained interpreter who knows the subject and who is well prepared for the task. We can also say that Convey is definitely more accurate than no interpreter, or an interpreter who has not gone through the extensive training that's necessary to do a professional job. And we see this sometimes for more uncommon languages where it's hard to find trained interpreters, that you might have to resort to somebody who just happens to know the language, which is very different from actually being a trained interpreter. So there are situations where Convey can really help with accessibility and communicating across language lines. But there are other situations that are high stakes enough that it might be preferable to have a human interpreter. And there might also be some situations where Convey can be more helpful for people. So say, for example, you're an exchange student, you're an American, you're studying in China, for example. It would be quite helpful to see some subtitles in English during your lectures, or maybe you're in a house of worship and you kind of know the language of the country. So with Convey, what that can do is you can still listen to the original floor language, but you can get some support through subtitles rather than being forced to only listen to the interpreter language. So very interesting product. Please let me and Nancy or your local partner know if you have more questions about it, as we will focus mostly on human interpretation in this specific webinar.
And Per, can I just add one thing?
Yeah, of course.
If you are going to be attending ISC in January, we obviously will have all of our different solutions there, but to see AI in motion and to see it work, and you can choose a language if you have a second language, that is the way to really see the power of Convey Video. So we will be at ISC this year or next year.
Yes, definitely. Both Nancy and myself and a whole team, so hope to see some of you guys there. Digi-Wave for interpretation. Digi-Wave really shines in the interpretation area. We have a couple of unique features. I mentioned what we call the true interpretation mode. Here's another illustration of that, where the interpreter will have a transceiver, a DLT-400. They will listen to channel 0, English, the floor language, in their ear. With the same transceiver, the same headset, they can speak in another language, for example, Japanese, and the audience can listen to that language. Now you see one interpreted language in this scenario, but you could actually have 14 interpreted languages in addition to the floor language, so a total of 15 languages with the same principle that everybody will listen to the floor language in their ear, and they can all interpret into different languages. Now, if you have a situation, this example is with English and Japanese. This happens a lot in Japan in corporate settings, where these are the two main languages. In a lot of Latin America, and maybe even here in the States, you might have a similar situations between English and Spanish, where you have two languages that you're using, but you're switching fairly frequently between them. So a couple of years ago, we developed what we call bilingual mode. So you see the presenter in the first example. The presenter will be somebody speaking Japanese. We have a bilingual interpreter. When the presenter speaks in Japanese, he is on channel 1 as the output channel, and the English audience can listen to channel 1 and get the English interpretation. Now, say another person comes up, or we also have the ability to have different presenters with their own devices. In either case, the presenter language switches to English. All the interpreter has to do is to push that little arrow up button. He will then change the channel to Japanese on channel 2, and the audience, the Japanese audience, can listen in on channel 2 for the interpretation. So a pretty nifty little feature that works well in a lot of scenarios. The last thing I wanted to mention about Digi-Wave is another unique feature, which is our portable relay mode. So the idea here is that an interpreter can provide interpretation into a relay language by only using a portable DLT-400. So in this example, the floor language is Japanese. We might have some people, a Japanese speaker in the audience, listen to Japanese. The first DLT, the first interpreter is listening to Japanese, interpreting to English. We have some audience members listening to English. Now the challenge is our poor Spanish interpreter does not know Japanese. The good news is he knows English. So he has the ability to either listen to the original floor language in Japanese, or to listen to the English relay language. And that enables the listeners who need Spanish interpretation to listen to his channel. So kind of a unique and neat features for Digi-Wave that works well in a portable setting. However, most of the time we have found when there is a larger number of languages, it's typically in a more formal conference. So I will spend some time now talking about our interpreter console, the IC2, and how that works in a fixed interpretation setting. So the IC2, if you look at it, you might notice that the controls on the right and left side are the same. The reason for that is that it's designed for two interpreters. So two interpreters taking turns sitting in the same interpretation booth can use the same console. This can be coupled with any of our wireless technologies, and we can link up to 20 of the IC2, so we can provide support for 20 different languages with IC2. And the IC2 have two channels as the output, as you can see on the back side, channel 1 and channel 2. And that means that we support not only the floor language, but also a relay language. So we developed this product. It's called IC2 because it's the second generation. The first generation, believe it or not, was called the IC1. And we had plenty of testers and plenty of discussions with professional interpreters to try and make a product that has enough features, but is really user-friendly. So I know we have some interpreters online. I know we have some people who are not interpreters online. But if you imagine the task of listening to someone saying something very important in one language, speaking in another language at the same time, you have to focus on this and less of the technicalities of the equipment you're using. So for the interpreter, the red buttons basically says, is it my turn to interpret, or am I on a break, or the other person is interpreting? So you touch the microphone button when you're active. The blue buttons decide what you're listening to. Am I listening to the floor language? Or am I in a situation where I don't understand the floor language? I need to listen to the relay language. And the third button that is sometimes controlled by the interpreter, sometimes this is being set up by the conference technician, is the output button. So if this unit is the one providing the relay language, this yellow output button needs to be pushed. So I'll get into exactly how that works very soon here. So which technology does the IC2 work with? It works basically with any wireless technology, preferably from Williams AV. So from the IC2, we take a line level XLR out, which can go into our infrared transmitters, FM, the Digi-Wave, using the Digi-Wave Connect dock you see in the bottom there, or our Wavecast audio via Wi-Fi. The hardware setup is fairly straightforward. You'll have an output from your DSP transferring the floor language into one of the IC2s in the chain. One and only one IC2 in the chain needs to be connected to the floor language. The IC2s in the chain are all connected with a Cat5 cable. And then on the output side, most IC2s will have one transmitter for the translated or interpreter language connected to it. One of the IC2s in the chain typically uses both of the output channels, which means you can accommodate for a floor or a relay language, which I will show now. So in this example, we have a 3-language conference, English, Spanish, and Italian. We have, the main house audio. The floor is being connected to an IC2 unit using an XLR cable. We have 2 English to Spanish interpreters taking turns. They are different sizes because the one is the active one and the other one is the one waiting for his or her turn. This IC2 is connected via an XLR cable to some kind of wireless transmitter. So it could be an FM transmitter, it could be an IR transmitter, Wavecast audio via Wi-Fi, or Digi-Wave digital RF, for example. This transmitter is in turn connected wirelessly to a number of receivers. So anyone in the audience who needs to listen to Spanish will have a receiver set to channel 1. Now, we might have a situation where some people are hard of hearing, for example. They might want to listen to the floor language, or as languages are switching, we might have some people who needs to listen to English interpretation. So remember, we have 2 outputs in the IC2. So one output on channel 2 is typically connected to a transmitter transmitting on the common language, on the most used language in the conference, which is, in our example, will be English. That's being sent out on the wireless channel 2. Anyone listening to English will have a receiver on channel 2. This IC2 can be connected to one or several IC2s, can be daisy chained via cat cables. In our example, we just have 2 IC2s. The cat cable transfers the floor audio as well as any active relay audio between the different IC2s. The next IC2 is for the Italian interpreters. So they have the ability to interpret between English and Italian. That's being sent on a separate wireless channel, channel 3. Everybody needing Italian interpretation will listen to channel 3. Now, let's go through all the different scenarios. So scenario A is the floor language is English. Okay, the Spanish interpreter needs to interpret from English to Spanish. The setup on his IC2, remember the different color buttons, this is kind of the default setup. He just listens to the floor language. His output is set to the default, not active channel 1. This floor language English is being passed through to the second IC2, which is really helpful because that means the Italian interpreter can listen to English and interpret to Italian. So they will have the same standard setup listening to the floor language. The floor feed through, whenever there is not a relay language active, the floor, whatever the floor language is, will be fed through on channel 2. So on the right-hand side, the Spanish speakers listen to channel 1, the English speakers listen to channel 2, and the Italian speakers listen to channel 3. So I will change to another scenario now. And one point I want to make clear is the audience will continue to listen on the same channels. You'll see some crazy animation here with different colors and arrows going back and forth. But one of the key points is the right-hand side of this slide will not change. None of the hardwiring will change. And for the people in the conference, nothing will actually change for them. So when the floor language changes to Spanish, we have a Spanish interpreter. Things will change for the Spanish to English interpreter, right? So he will now interpret, instead of from English to Spanish, from Spanish to English. So that means he still listens to the floor, but either the interpreter or the event technician has to push that output button on the IC2 to make clear to the rest of the IC2s that the relay is active and that's provided from this IC2. So what that does, it means that not only the floor Spanish, which is actually relevant in our scenario, but the relay language, the language that this first interpreter is speaking in English, will be passed through the cat cable, which is very important because in our scenario, our Italian interpreter does not speak Spanish. So he needs to interpret from English into Italian. So the difference for the Italian interpreter is instead of interpreting directly from the presenter, he's interpreting from the relay language. So on the IC2, he needs to make sure he listens to relay, which means he can continue to listen to English. The final detail for this setup is, and this is done completely automatically, as soon as somebody pushes that relay button, there's no hardware wiring changes needed to be made, but as soon as there's a relay active, that's what's going to come through on channel 2. So as you see, with the crazy coloring and arrows and things hopping around. On the right-hand side, me as an audience member listening to English, I'm still listening on channel 2. Our Spanish friends are still listening on channel 1, and our Italian friends are still listening on channel 3. Now, the last scenario, what do you think that is, Nancy? It's Italian, okay? So now it gets exciting. We get the new color in, green for the Italian flag. We now have an Italian presenter. Now, in my scenario, I'm saying the Spanish interpreter does not know Italian. He only knows English, which could potentially be a problem. How this works is the floor Italian would be fed through the to the Italian interpreter. And the Italian interpreter, if you follow the green arrows, will now interpret from Italian to English. So he will now push the relay button saying, hey, I'm the guy interpreting into the common language. I'm providing the relay. And that will then be passed back up to the first interpreter through the Cat5 cable. So now it's the Spanish interpreter's turn to utilize the relay language. He can interpret from English, a language he's fluent in, into Spanish, and all he needs to do is to listen to the relay instead of the floor. For the setup, again, the only change is what the interpreters listen to, and to push the relay output button on the IC2 that provides the relay. There's no wiring changes. The relay will be automatically fed through on this channel 2. And me as an English speaker, I will still listen to the relay. So here's an overview. We'll share a presentation of the PowerPoints. If you want to follow all the crazy arrows, you'll have a chance to do that. The last thing I want to hit on before we get to the summary is some system design considerations. So I'll do that through an example. So one of the key questions is, what's the technology preference? In this example, the event company or the end user wants something that's easy to install. That leads us to FM. The number of interpreters consoles we need is the number of languages. We have 4 languages, so we need 4 minus 1, 3 interpreters consoles. For each interpreter console, we typically have 2 interpreters. They each need a headset, so 6 headsets in this case. Transmitter is a pretty easy calculation. We would need 1 transmitter per language, so 4 transmitters in this case. Receivers is the same as the number of participants, and it should be the number of participants who actually think they need interpretation. In this example, it's 100. Number of earphones is the same as number of receivers. In our examples, they were looking for something that's wipeable, which would be our ear 22. In most cases, you will probably need some chargers for receivers. It's fairly straightforward math. You take the number of receivers divided by the base per charger. So 100 divided by 12 is roughly 9. And finally, in some cases, you might want a carry case. So with our carry cases, we want to make sure we have enough slots for the receiver. Each case 54 has 60 slots, so plenty for the 100 receivers and some space for different accessories as well. So I'll go through this a little bit fast, but I will make a little plug. On the last slide, you will see a QR code to download our interpretation guide, and there are step-by-step directions and a little cheat sheets for how you put together an interpretation system. For our European friends, we have a different FM frequency, exactly the same principles, just different equipment. I wanted to point out Digi-Wave quickly, fits well when you have a highly secure situation, needing encryption. Otherwise, the same principles. For a fixed installation setting, we would recommend our Digi-Wave Connect, the DWD401, which can take a line in XLR. And one little extra detail for Digi-Wave is we have the opportunity to provide a repeater if we have a very large space. So one repeater per language in that case. Infrared, the really only difference as far as planning your system is that each of our transmitters and emitters support 2 languages. So for a 4-language scenario, you need 2 IRT2 emitters rather than 4. Wavecast, audio via Wi-Fi, has 2 interesting details. One of them is that we offer an 8-channel server. So for 4 languages, you would only need one of the WFT8s. The other interesting point is the whole idea behind Wavecast is that it's a BYOD technology. So the idea is you use your own mobile phone to receive the interpreted audio. We do still recommend that you provide some receivers for those people who forgot to charge their phones or have no space on them to download their app, etc., etc. What's the right number? There's no conventions for this, but to provide half the number of receivers seems to be a pretty reasonable idea. So you'll have a chance to get a break from my voice for a couple of minutes here. Nancy, would you mind summarizing what we talked about today?
Sure. So, language interpretation is needed in many various settings. And we've talked about from international organizations to corporations, house of worship, and schools. So just imagine going to a hospital in a different country and not being able to communicate your health needs with the doctor. Or it could be being summoned to be a juror in a court case and not understanding the evidence communicated by the defense or the prosecutor. Or another example is facilitating a global company meeting for employees in a different country and not allowing non-native employees to fully engage or comprehend. So thanks to globalization, the world is more connected than ever. And also there's a growing need for interpreters to help bridge the language barrier. So it expands beyond just a tool for communication, but language interpretation provides shared understanding. It helps avoid misinterpretation and removes cultural barriers. So each wireless technology that Per has discussed today, they have distinct advantages, and it depends on the application and the market. Now with Digi-Wave is that it offers a unique true interpretation mode, so that enables that you've got a portable solution and then also just using one interpretation receiver. And as Per had mentioned, there is this resource guide, and it's really good. I was looking at it last night, so thanks to marketing for putting that together. But it has all of the information. It gives you examples. And so either use the QR code or also the link that's attached. And in that way, you can go through there. And if you have any further questions, I can be reached. I'm active on Twitter and LinkedIn, and it's at Nancy Blanchard. If we are not connected on LinkedIn, please reach out. And then also my email address is nancyb@williamsav.com. So I appreciate you taking the time to watch our webinar today. I hope that it was educational. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over now to Tommy for questions.
Well, thank you guys. Anytime you're doing multinational or multi-language proposals or system designs, this really should be a line item on all of those documents. Let me ask Laura. Laura, do you have any questions on your end?
We do. We have 5 right now, so we'll get started. The first 2 here are referring to those relay charts that Per reviewed a few minutes earlier. The first is, does the floor language flow through the receiver when the interpreter is transmitting on the second channel?
Yes, it would. Yes, exactly. So how the IC2 works is it automatically flips if there is no relay language, the floor language, whatever the presenter language is, will flow through as in my example, where we, for example, have an interpreter for Spanish into English and presses that relay language, that would flow through on that channel too as well.
Got it. And the second one is pretty similar to the first. So in scenario B, where floor equals Spanish, those on channel 1 will listen to the Spanish interpreter, not to the floor audio in case they need assistive listening, correct?
On channel 1, and I probably didn't draw that out very clearly, they would listen to the floor presenter language. So when there is a relay language active, there is a flip-flop of what's being sent out on channel 1 or channel 2. So when the floor language is Spanish, on channel 1, you would listen to the Spanish floor language, for example, for assistive listening purposes. If the Spanish interpreter is interpreting from English to Spanish, for example, you would listen to the interpreted language on that channel 1.
Got it. Thank you. So what are your thoughts on using audio via Wi-Fi for large events to avoid providing receivers?
So it's an interesting scenario. So we've done a few large events. There's a very large American company that sells products online, for example, that has an annual conference in Las Vegas every year. So we've used audio via Wi-Fi to support that conference. I think they had 4 different languages. So that's very helpful, right? When you have a conference where you have thousands of people, if they can mostly use your mobile phone, it's very it helps with the whole logistics parts. One thing to keep in mind is if you have a large conference like that, there's probably going to be a pretty complicated network. Even though the audio via Wi-Fi doesn't add a whole lot of bandwidth requirements, still, if you have thousands of people connected, it's something to think about. So for those very large conferences, either ourselves or one of our very capable integrators, like a PSNI member, for example, would usually go out several days in advance to make sure that the network is set up. So I guess in summary, it could be a very good solution, but you just have to be aware that there would have to be some preparatory work in order for the conference to be successful.
Great. A few more. When arranging interpretation event, do you need to plan on 2 interpreters per language?
Yeah, I would say that should definitely be the standard, and it differs a little bit from country to country, and how formal the event is, but the guidelines for interpreters, so the AAAI, for example, have some guidelines. They always specify that in order to get the best performance out of your interpreters, there should be 2 interpreters taking turn, especially if it's a full day or a longer event.
Got it. So with artificial intelligence solutions becoming more common, is there still a need for human interpreters?
Yeah, I think so. So Williams started developing AI, working with that gosh, it's probably about 4 years ago now. And at that point, the technology was nowhere close to being a commercially viable solution. And it's gotten to the point where it works well in certain scenarios. But, highly trained human interpreters who have the ability to really know their specific topic that's being discussed, that, for big conferences will learn all the specific terms, probably learn some of the background. In certain situations, they might be kind of diplomats as well, while AI is developing. And while it's a good fit in certain situations, I think that over the next foreseeable future, there will still be situations where you really need that professional, highly trained human interpreter.
All right, and that concludes our Q&A. Thank you guys so much, and I'll hand it back to Tom.
Well, guys, thank you so much. That your programs are always so very well presented, but we want to thank you and everybody at Williams AV for your support of over 100 of our PS&I service providers worldwide. I know sometimes it's a challenge, and we appreciate all the effort you guys put into it.
Thanks so much, Tommy.
For our general audience, Williams AV products are available through all of our worldwide service providers. They can be found on the PS&I website. It's just simply psni.org. For the certified service providers on our meeting today, all of the information regarding our program with Williams AV and all of the contact information you'll need is listed on our vendor portal. Nancy and Pear's information is there. If you need additional assistance, you can always reach out to me at troberts@psni.org, and I'll be glad to point you in the right direction. Nancy and Pear, thank you so much for being with us today. Is there anything else you want to say before we close?
No, just as I mentioned earlier, thank you to everyone who attends our webinars. Thank you for the PS&I members and for your support, and look forward to working with you in 2023.
Thank you very much.
All right, guys. Well, on behalf of the PS&I Global Alliance, we'd like to thank everyone for being with us. This concludes our webinar for today. Happy holidays to everyone. Take care and stay safe.